All right, folks. Well, this should be fun because I'm going to learn a little bit, and then I'm going to push back and challenge my guests also a little bit on what's going on. Well, first, I have Dave Feldman, a recurrent guest on the show now. He'll introduce himself again, and then Nick Norwitz, first time on the show, but his life will forever change after this one. As Dave will tell him. So let's start with a little bit of introduction, and then I'll set the stage as to why I have you on. Dave, I'll start with Nick because he's the newbie on Healthcare Unfiltered. Nick, a little bit about you and just what you do, what you're doing, and what got you interested in nutritional research.
For sure. Well, first of all, thanks for so much for having me on, Chadi. This is a pleasure, and I'm very excited. My background, my academic background is as a PhD researcher from Oxford. I did my PhD in ketogenics and brain metabolism, studying Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. But because of a personal experience with keto, really got interested in lipidology. I think probably people listening might know some of Dave's background, but I had a parallel introduction to this field where I, tried a carbohydrate-restricted diet for metabolic reasons. For me, it was I had very bad colitis, and a ketogenic diet very much helped me. But was surprised to find that my LDL cholesterol shot through the roof, went from like 95 to well over 300. And I was eating a high fiber, very Mediterranean, low red meat kind of diet. So I found that very interesting. And that's kind of what introduced me to Dave's work. And ever since then, I've been, just so interested in this space from a scientific standpoint. So I want to preface this conversation by saying I have a tendency to get really enthused and excited from a scientific perspective. And I hope nobody confuses that with the perception that I'm saying, this is a low risk profile, that this is nothing to worry about. I just kind of get, the nerdy scientific enthusiasm. So I'm very excited about the observation we've made. And I'll pause there and pass it off to Dave.
Nick, just really quick, what do you do day in and day out? Is this to do full time? Is there an additional element of your research that you do as well?
Yeah. So I'm a medical student, actually. I finished my PhD at Oxford, and now I'm a student at Harvard Med. So my days are mostly spent studying, whatever we had to study. Dermatomyositis, lupus, whatever was last week.
When do you finish?
Doing this. I just started, actually. So ended up happening was I did my undergrad at Dartmouth, and I was finishing up, and I applied to fellowships for the UK and for medical school, and I got into HMS. And then I also got a scholarship to go to Oxford. So they let me defer. So I deferred for 3 years, went to my PhD, and now I'm back starting this year. So I'm actually a first year medical student. We just finished our first semester. So yeah.
Oh, good luck and congrats, and go Patriots. I'm a Patriots fan, so you better be a Patriots fan. You're in Boston.
I'm not a football guy. I'm not an American football guy. I honestly,
good.
Sorry.
Then Manchester United?
Yeah, my family's a big on soccer. My brother's actually played internationally. My first time to Oxford, I was traveling with him around. So and my dad's a big rugby guy, but
that's great.
It's kind of tangential now.
Dave, a little bit about you and how did you get to meet Nick?
Well, of course, I'm a senior software engineer, entrepreneur. I went a lot more extensively into my backstory in our first podcast together, so I won't go too much into that right now. But of course, the story. I became very obsessed with lipidology and started doing a lot of experiments, for which I kept reporting back that data to the low-carb community. And over time, this helped develop two different things, one being the lipid energy model and how much the lipid energy model, as it's been growing and burgeoning, would ultimately lead us to the study that we've talked about a couple of times now on this phenotype lean mass hyper-responders, which we'll get into in a moment. I was fortunate enough to meet Nick while we were both sort of invited to work on a case study with Dr. Tro. And we just immediately synergized. Nick had already had kind of his own origin story, as he was just talking about now. And that already kind of, in the same way, we definitely have that commonality, that our own story of how we were surprised by our cholesterol levels going up led us to dive deep into trying to understand it, trying to understand what's going on mechanistically, trying to understand what's going on from a risk stratification. And I'll just repeat what Nick said. In fact, I'm probably more careful to say it these days than I ever have been before. You've heard me say it several times over, Chatty. While I'm cautiously optimistic with regard to higher total and LDL cholesterol in this context of metabolic fat adaptation, which we'll be talking about, I'm probably spending more time emphasizing the cautious and less on the optimistic side, because we really don't know until we get the data in as to what the true level of risk actually is in this context.
Great. And, we've talked a lot, Dave. I've had you a couple of times, and we've had other folks on the show. We've talked about the keto diet, the low carb model. So I'm going to try not to rehash some of the other things we've talked about, although we probably need to level set a little bit as we describe this. But really the reason, my motivation to having you on, is a paper that you are both co-authors on, and I believe Nick is the first author, and that was published, came out sometime in November. And for context, we're taping this late December 2021. So I wanted to talk about the paper first, into what led to this paper, how was the paper designed, what were the findings of the paper, what are the clinical implications of these findings, what are the shortcomings, and so on, and then what's next, because obviously your paper did make a lot of headlines on social media, where there are a lot of people who were completely opposed to it, a lot of people who were pro, all of these things. So let's go over it, because I always feel Twitter is a short format. You can never really discuss that. So who wants to take on telling us how did this paper come about? And we'll split all of these items.
I think you deserve to start, Dave, maybe back in 2017 when you hypothesized what became this paper.
Sure. Well, I'll really kind of give more of the 50,000 foot overview and really hand it back off to Nick. But let's kind of first talk about what I observed, what Nick would later observe, and what so many of us in the low carb community have observed, that it's not typically just LDLs going up on a low carb diet, but particularly in the context of what seems to be otherwise metabolically healthy individuals. I'm more metabolically healthy than my sister and my dad, which I mentioned before, and they started a ketogenic diet around the same time I did, but they did not see this pronounced increase of LDL. We would also see this combination of HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, going up, and triglycerides going down. And I mean in a very pronounced way, all three of these in a much more exceptional, what I like to call triad, a lipid triad. And this seemed to be fairly ubiquitous. This seemed to be common among the low carb community, particularly as this sort of new wave of people would come into keto who weren't already coming from a health challenged state. So as you know, the first wave, if you will, of Atkins were folks that would just try anything to try to lose weight, and often already had other underlying conditions that they were dealing with. As keto became more popular, you were finding a lot more people like myself, who I wasn't really severe type 2 diabetic. I was just sort of pre-diabetic, but was willing to try not just low carb, but literally going ketogenic, which is to say really, really low carb, and therefore becoming fat adapted. So I would see this pattern, and this led to some early beginnings of, how I think of the energy model, which is, the elevator pitch, which I go into much more detail in that prior podcast, but the elevator pitch is, look, if you're going to get powered more by fat, you need more carrier proteins. And that's not just albumin, which a lot of people don't hear much about, but a very famous carrier protein, which a lot of people do hear about, which is ApoB. And that means that there could be a reason why you'd see higher LDL cholesterol, and as it turns out, higher HDL cholesterol. So without unpacking that too much, that explains the triad. And in 2017, that's when I said, I now really see this in the most pronounced way in those folks who seem to be the leanest and the seemingly most metabolically fit. They oftentimes are athletic. They oftentimes are like runners and cyclists and so forth. They seem to have the most dramatic increases in LDL. And Chatty, for anybody who's not yet heard, I know you're aware of this. We're not just talking about like an LDL of 150 or 180. We're talking about LDLs of 300, 400, 500, et cetera. And so I termed this at the time lean mass hyper-responders, because the term hyper-responder was already there before for people who see high LDL after going on a ketogenic diet. And I said lean mass hyper-responder, and then set those 3 cut points. And to my surprise, there was way more lean mass hyper-responders than I thought. And now we have a Facebook group of somewhere around like 7,500. So flash forward to this year, 2021, as I mentioned earlier, we were getting put together, Nick and I were being put together to complement this case series. And that's when Nick came on board, who himself is a very pronounced lean mass hyper-responder.
So Nick, tell us then about, thanks Dave, what's the paper about?
Before I get into that, I'm just going to rehash what Dave said. You said 50,000 foot view. I want to zoom out and go 100,000 foot just for a moment to kind of set the stage for what we found. I'm going to do that with the 2 framing things. First and foremost, I just want to talk about the risk profile of most patients now who are at risk for cardiovascular disease. And that over time, what we've seen is actually, LDL levels are stable or actually dropping. There's a beautiful paper by Peter Libby, but recently describing the changing landscape of atherosclerosis. So basically making the point, LDL levels, they are stable yet or continue to drop with these new innovations in pharmacotherapy, like PCSK9 inhibitors. They're now like doing, gene editing on monkeys to lower their LDL. Anyway, that aside, the risk profile that predominates is atherogenic dyslipidemia. So, when you get a lipid panel, you get really 3 numbers back on a standard panel: the LDL, which people tend to focus on the most, but also the HDL and the triglycerides. And really, it's important to look at those 3 in context. But what you often see in most people at risk is LDL that's normal or even sometimes low, with very low HDL or just low HDL and high triglycerides. That's the definition of atherogenic dyslipidemia, that high triglycerides and low HDL. And what Dave was hypothesizing back in 2017 with this lean mass hyper-responder phenotype was that he was seeing people with this astronomically high LDL, which already is kind of going away from the standard pattern of risk now, but then the opposite profile of atherogenic dyslipidemia. Instead of having low HDL and high triglycerides, really high HDL and low triglycerides, forming this really odd triad that you really don't see anywhere else. And in fact, the cut point Dave chose back in 2017 were very extreme. So the cut points for what is colloquially known as a lean mass hyper-responder are LDL of equal to or above 200 milligrams per deciliter, HDL above 80, and triglycerides below 70. To fit any one of those cut points is very rare in isolation. So to fit all 3 at the same time in union, by chance, would be like basically negligible. So if people are actually fulfilling those cut points by chance, then there's maybe something mechanistic going on underneath. That would be the proposal. And we'll get into the lipid energy model later. But what then Dave was kind of observing was another paradox, or seeming paradox, which is that it's the leaner athletic people that, at least in his observation, tended to be the ones with this jump in LDL. Which is kind of interesting if you think about, okay, LDL is bad cholesterol, which means a jump in LDL is an unhealthy response, right? So if this observation is true, why is the lean healthy people that are having the jump in the bad cholesterol? That kind of seems weird. So anyway, this was all just, empiric observation until the publication of this paper. And what we did.
But you were only seeing these in the setting of low carb, right?
Yes. So it will be the lean healthy people who then go low carb,
right,
and then develop this profile, whereas before their LDLs will be more normal, and we actually observed that in this paper. So what we found was when we took a group of people who were
before you tell me what you found, I want to go through the methods of the paper, how you got there. So because we're going to go over the results, I want to explain to listeners how did you conduct, what's the methodology to get to the results? What were the methods? What did you actually do?
Yeah. Well, for this preliminary study, it was actually pretty simple. Dave had a standing survey where people would report their lipid panels and their intake, their BMI, and then we did an analysis on that survey. Now, obviously, that's limited in that it's survey data, which is typically, thought of as being relatively unreliable. So we did have certain checks in place to, suggest that the data might be more reliable. The data that didn't look reliable, we got rid of, and we had, code that automated that, so there wouldn't be, our bias employed. And then what we did, and I think this was really important, was engage basically in what's known as a hypothesis naive exploratory analysis, where rather than go through the data and try to mold it to fit our confirmation bias, we basically just told the computer, pick out the variables that are the best predictors of LDL change, which was a methodology that well suited the sort of data we had. Because in order to get a finding using this method, this approach, this hypothesis naive exploratory analysis on the given data, in order to see any sort of correlations, basically you would have to have like a massive coup among participants where like, the leaner ones are reporting their triglycerides, HDL and LDL a little bit differently along a continuum to the people of higher BMI, which seems quite unlikely. So I think that the methodology was well suited to the data collected, but we did only have survey data at hand. And that was actually kind of necessary for this approach, one, because of expense, but two, because this isn't so common a phenomenon that you can just go around and like pick people. So to get a cohort of sufficient size, we had like about 1,000 respondents. You do need to kind of, pool from greater distance, so to speak. So that was the approach.
Dave, since you created the survey that you were asking, did you use, so you said there's the Facebook of 7,000 folks, so you actually send the survey to your Facebook, or you just announce the survey? And can you maybe go really high level, how many questions in the survey, the type of questions? And I liked what Nick mentioned, every survey, obviously there's, you're not going to have access to the medical charts. So if somebody tells you my LDL is 400, they probably, I can't tell, but I presume they're not really faxing you or emailing you the actual lipid profile. Maybe they are, I don't know. But tell us about the survey, the questions, and who did you survey? Like, how did you reach those folks?
Well, I announced it basically everywhere I could. So certainly in my presence on social media, the blog, on Twitter. As you know, a lot of people follow me on Twitter across the spectrum, though granted, that's going to be predominantly more people who are low carb, and probably some even further predominance of people who are, with this triad or even themselves lean mass hyper-responders. We have the Lean Mass Hyper-Responder Facebook group, but we also have just a general cholesterol code Facebook group. Made the announcement on both of those as well. And so for having 1,000 participants, I actually didn't think that there would be that many lean mass hyper-responders given just, how broad it was. It actually made it advantageous for us to look at this data set once we knew we would have 100-ish something lean mass hyper-responders. Because at that point in time, we're like, okay, well, this is enough data for us to look at in a meaningful way, with the full acknowledgement that it is limited in the fact that it's an internet survey. But our third missing colleague, who's definitely part of our triad, which is Adrian Sotomoda, he is the one who pioneered, our analyses in many respects, who initiated this hypothesis naive version. But on top of that, who would explain much more eloquently than I'm about to, that the advantage that you can look at, and epidemiologists will point to when you do have enough data, is that when you start seeing the curves and they seem to have a lot of correlation stepwise, that gives a lot more stronger indication of correlation, as opposed to like dividing between one group or another, because there can be more selection bias if it's like, oh, people who have high LDL and seem otherwise metabolically healthy are either in this bucket or they're in this other bucket of everybody who's not that. Well, if instead you see a stepwise change along with other variables to where it has a very tight correlation, I know I'm kind of trying to layman person this up, but I think you follow me. That's where you have to start saying, look, could everybody who answered this survey be colluding to have that level of, of distinctive correlation in these curves? probably not, right? And that's why we look to see just how strong those curves actually are. And that's part of how we were looking at this data.
No, good point. But like, what kind of questions did you ask? Just you asked, like, give me the number of LDL you have, number of it, like were they just pointed, like, how many questions were they? And did you have any access to the actual reports of what they were reporting, even in a subset of them?
Off the top of my head, I would say that I think something around 15 to 20 questions.
Okay.
We would ask them about what their lipid levels were from just before the diet they were on, and then what their lipid levels are now to whatever diet they were on. We excluded, I want to say around 40% of participants, because unless they reported, as one of the other things we're asking is how many grams of carbs they were having per day, unless they reported 130 or less, we didn't even consider them as far as being on a carb-restricted diet. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, it was 130, right?
Yeah, it was 130. We had a lot of different cut points or exclusion criteria. I think we did cut out 40 to 50% of people because we wanted to make sure the data were as reliable as possible. And it was actually on the table, just because you brought it up, Chatty, to do a validation cohort and ask for lipid data from the labs, because that would have been one option. We didn't end up going that route just because of what Dave said. When the results panned out, it seemed very unlikely that we could possibly get them without a massive coup. I mean, just like take as an example, just to kind of enforce what we're saying. Like, imagine 3 people, BMIs 21, 23, 26, right? And in order to, get a correlation along a continuum, you'd have to have the person with the lowest BMI, report the highest LDL, highest HDL, lowest triglyceride. Person in the middle report something intermediate to the person on the end. That's 3 people. Now, could they do that by chance? Yes, maybe, probably not. Again, it would take some degree of coordination. We had 548. And when you look at the p-values for all these different correlations, BMI, LDL-C change, HDL, BMI, all these different things, the p-values were like 10 to the negative 16th with really tight confidence intervals. So we talked it over with our team, with some statisticians, and at that point, it just seemed like a little bit of overkill and kind of unnecessary. But I think that would have been a valid methodology.
It's also worth pointing out, Chatty, that this was in combination with the original case series I was just mentioning. In the case series, of course, we did have validated not only blood work, but also blood work in how they arrived to the lean mass hyperresponder status, as well as the intervention of added carbohydrates and how that would then change their cholesterol levels in kind. So at least that group further established what is
true
in a very distinctive way with very validated blood work, as well as genetic confirmation as well.
Okay, so Nick, tell us the number. I think you already alluded to the number of folks that responded, and tell us some of the results that came out of the survey and the responses you received.
For sure. So yeah, we had 548 final included participants. And what we observed was, 2 main things in the original, hypothesis naive exploratory analysis, that there was a strong inverse correlation between BMI and LDL change. Basically, that it was the leaner people having the larger increases in LDL. And in addition, that triglyceride to HDL ratio was inversely associated with LDL change. So it was the people with the, again, opposite profile to atherogenic dyslipidemia, the higher HDL, the lower triglycerides, even before starting the diet. So they're metabolically healthy before starting the diet or on the diet. That was associated with larger LDL change. So basically, it was the lean, metabolically healthy people. The leaner and more metabolically healthy you were, the larger your LDL change. For people who want to look at the paper, that is really, I think, nicely demonstrated in figure 2. We have a 3D bar graph where you can see as you go along, the X and the Z axes, as you go down in BMI or down in triglyceride to HDL ratio, the LDL just keeps on going up and up and up, the LDL change. So, for people in the lowest quartile for BMI and LDL change, BMI and triglyceride to HDL ratio, I think it was the mean LDL change was 135 milligrams per deciliter, which is massive.
Dave, these are folks who before before they went on a low carb diet, before they went on a ketogenic diet or low carb or carb restricted diet, probably is more scientifically a better description. Their LDL and the triglyceride to HDL ratio. So the triglycerides, their HDL and LDL were not that high. Like I presume you asked them for their baseline numbers and you saw that the changes in LDL, HDL triglycerides were after they went on the low carb diet. And how long did they go on the low carb diet before you started seeing these changes?
So of course it varied based on what the participant reported themselves. I don't remember the mean right offhand.
The mean between tests was 700 and something days.
Right. So close to around.
So
yeah.
2 years.
Right. Now,
yeah,
now I want to tack on just a couple of things to what Nick said. So it's worth emphasizing those two correlates. The first one is triglyceride to HDL ratio in the prior reported levels, the prior LDL. So that was very predictive towards resulting LDL change. So if you were presumably more metabolically healthy, and again, we caveat all of these with presumably in that, for example, we didn't have blood pressure numbers or other things along those lines. But generally speaking, yeah, if you have low triglyceride to HDL ratio, you typically are much more likely to be considerably metabolically healthy, but with the usual caveats. And the other is the BMI as resulting in the final data. So if your BMI was lower alongside whatever your lipid profile was, your LDL tended to be higher. But here's one other very fascinating thing about it, which is that actually the LDL in the very first lipid profile between lean mass hyperresponders and non-lean mass hyperresponders was nearly identical. In fact, the lean mass hyperresponders, if I'm not mistaken, it was slightly less, actually.
It was, I think, the non-lean mass hyperresponders like 134 milligrams per deciliter. Lean mass hyperresponders was 132. I think the p-value was like 0.85. So not significantly different, but just as a kind of pokey point, yeah, I think it was a little bit lower in the LMHR.
So think about that, Chatty. You have two groups of people that all you know is what their LDL levels are before they start this diet. And then all of a sudden you see in one group of people, the most pronounced, and I mean substantially increased levels of LDL. What are two things that you could pick out that you think would be predictive of that change? And we think our paper provides at least some strong hypothesis building as to what that would likely be. And that's why we're pretty excited about it.
So Nick, you found these findings, and I think Dave was alluding that you're starting to think of hypotheses as to why that may be, like the BMI inversely correlated with the LDL, as well as with the triglycerides to HDL ratio, which are the metabolically healthy. What are some of the theories that you came up with? And then maybe Dave could try to start outlining some of the shortcomings as you were looking at the paper. What are the drawbacks? And then we'll go back and forth into what the practical implications.
For sure. I would say that this paper does not actually delve into the lipid energy model. That is our next, or one of our next projects. Actually, we were working on it most of today, but we can get into that. I'm not sure if we want to go through. There was a case series Dave alluded to, which had some interesting findings. And then maybe we can talk about the lipid energy model. It just wasn't covered in this paper, just to be clear.
So are these findings that led to the hypothesis of the lipid energy model? I may have missed that.
No, the lipid energy model has been basically in development for the last like 5-6 years. Right. I mean, I would say the way I would describe the story of it up to this point in time is it's been something that I've kind of made graphics on. I've done presentations on. As you know, I've interviewed with people like Peter Attia discussing it then. But in 2020 and 2021, a lot more has been coming out in the literature that I think has been supportive of the lipid energy model. And I've been so fortunate to have Nick Norwitz and Adrian Sotomoda, who have connected, and the three of us have been working hard on putting together a paper for it. And I think that it's really supercharged. It's really like advanced the progress of it, which is why we're excited to get a paper to it together. I think if I'm going to give you the quick pitch version, which is sort of what I was saying from before, I think in the case of these folks, what we would hypothesize, again, with the emphasis, that's a hypothesis, is that those folks who tend to be leaner, such as Nick, they're going to be more likely to see this pronounced increase in LDL because they're trafficking more fat in circulation. They're doing that because they're powered much more by fat, and therefore there's going to be, again, more need for carrier proteins to make that possible.
So that's that's part of the theory of the observation that you made, that because you're leaner, you need more fat to carry on. I mean, I guess I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
When you saw the observation. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yes. So the general observation of lean mass hyperresponders and the lipid energy model precede this paper. This paper was now formalizing the observation that we see, this lipid triad, the lean mass hyper-responder phenotype, for which we already have ideas that we're going to formalize in another paper. But the basic idea, the hypothesis, is that for lean people who are metabolically healthy in a carbohydrate-restricted state, to supply energy, the energy they need, a lot of it is trafficked globally by triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. One is VLDL, so very low density lipoprotein. So you basically have your liver. Actually, you can start at your adipocytes, your fat tissue. You know, when you're burning fat, you're releasing these free fatty acids into your bloodstream. They're being sucked up by your heart, by your muscle tissue, and also by your liver. Then your liver repackages them as triglyceride on VLDL particles, and then those get sent out to the
Nick, I think we're probably losing a little bit. I think.
Yeah, Nick, you cut out there.
Yeah, your cutoff of your connection was a little bit in and out. So we may have missed a couple of things you were saying.
Where were we?
Start with triglyceride-rich lipoprotein secretion at the liver.
Yeah. So then your liver will repackage these free fatty acids into triglycerides, put them on VLDL, ship them back out. And then the VLDL are turned over by this really critical protein. This is at the center of the lipid energy model, lipoprotein lipase. And then the fatty acids will go into adipocytes. They'll then flux through to skeletal muscles, will go directly to skeletal muscles. And what happens when you turn over VLDL by lipoprotein lipases, VLDL, in part of their lineage, they turn into LDL, which then hang around in the bloodstream for longer than the VLDL. And then in the remodeling of the surface of the VLDL, you actually increase your HDL cholesterol. So these VLDL, they're rich in triglycerides. And when the LPL, lipoprotein lipase enzyme, breaks them down, those triglycerides drop. So that's 0.1 of the triad. LDL goes up because VLDL will decay into LDL. And if there's more VLDL secretion, more LDL. But in the process, surface components from the VLDL actually go on to HDL, which serve as an acceptor particle. So then you get this triad of low triglycerides, because they're being pulled out of the VLDL, the high LDL, and the high HDL. And so basically the triad, the magnitude of the triad, should go hand in hand with the degree of lipoprotein lipase mediated VLDL turnover in the periphery. That's what we'd predict.
Dave, anything you want to add to the hypothesis that Nick outlined?
No, I thought you did a great job. The only thing I would tweak, Nick, is I do think some amount of cholesterol esters from the VLDL turnover will end up in the HDL pool, but that's like the only thing that I would tweak, right?
Yeah.
But bottom line is HDL in many contexts metabolically can almost serve as sort of a rough proxy of lipoprotein lipase activity. Again, roughly and in that specific context. And that's why we believe that you see that pronounced level of increase, the more lean mass hyperresponder somebody is. So once again, those cut points that Nick mentioned earlier, 280, 70, you find that there actually are some who are even more lean mass hyperresponder than that, where, for example, their LDL might be 300 or 400. And guess what? They also tend to have typically even higher HDL. We've seen HDL in the 100, 120, 150 even. And oftentimes triglyceride much lower than 70, such as 50 or 60 or something like that. And my guess is, Chatty, you probably by this point in time have seen some of these lipid profiles yourself, given how common this is becoming in the community, which is why we need to know, a lot more about the risk profile as well.
So basically what the paper is doing in a high level, I want to try to summarize this for listeners, is that you took a bunch of folks, 500 plus, who were on low carb diet, restricted diet. You have their numbers of the cholesterol. You have all of them received less than 130 or 150 grams of carbs a day, right?
That's what they
were.
less
than 130. Most were much less. I think median was 20.
Right.
So most were very low carb.
Very low. And what you've observed, high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides, and you saw that these inversely correlating with the body mass index. So these are folks that are lean, but they still have high LDL and so on. Any other observation from the paper, and then we'll go into what that means.
Yeah, let me add one more thing, because we'll make our mutual friend Ethan Weiss happy by explaining this next part, because this is kind of important. So a lot of folks are going to say, hey, that's great that you've helped to identify lean mass hyperresponders. I'm not comfortable being a lean mass hyperresponder, for which we absolutely can understand if that's where they're coming from, right? There's going to be many people who are comfortable. There's going to be many people who are not comfortable. Again, that's where the vast majority of existing lipidologists and cardiologists, that's where they're going to stand, is that there should be steps that are taken to do something about it. In our paper, because of what we see with Dr. Tro's patients, those patients were refusing pharmacological solutions. They did not want to go on cholesterol-lowering medication. And so as part of what Dr. Tro would have them consider is that they could, in fact, reintroduce 50 to 100 carbs per day. And in doing so, would we see, as would be predicted by the lipid energy model, that indeed their LDL would drop substantially? And that's exactly what we would see. And it's been quite substantial. There was a lot more than we were able to even get into our case study by the point of publication, but of course we have 5 cases. And Nick could speak a lot more to the specificity of those cases. He worked much more in that area, but I emphasize this because this should be a paper that I would hope a lot of folks who are concerned about this profile, or just for that matter, the hyper response in general, seeing a high LDL as a result of going on a ketogenic diet, might feel that this might offer some possibility for a potential solution just by bringing in a bit more carbs to take it back down again.
Do we know why these folks were refusing cholesterol lowering agents? Do we have any, were the survey, were they afraid of something? Is there anything?
I think the majority of them just wanted to experiment with the lifestyle approaches first, as opposed to starting pharmacotherapy. So, in their perspective, if I can just add a sweet potato to my diet rather than taking a medication for the rest of my life, why wouldn't I? I can maintain a low carb diet. I can maintain my good triglycerides, HDL, and I just get to eat a sweet potato instead of having a statin. I mean, the one guy literally added a sweet potato's worth of carbs. His LDL dropped from 665 to 185. That's a drop of 480. And we also know, and I don't know if this is relevant to these individuals' choices since I wasn't their healthcare provider, but from other lean mass hyper-responders that, the medications won't have as potent an effect as reintroducing carbohydrates. Me and Dave were just talking 2 days ago to a MD PhD lean mass hyper-responder attending at Mass General who tried a statin as a lean mass hyper-responder, and it really didn't do much. It did so little that he just decided it's not even worth it. So the medications at this degree of LDL increase, for whatever reason, don't appear to be that impactful. I have heard rumors that ezetimibe might be more potent than statins in this population, but right now that's all just hearsay. So I think for these individuals, I know one tried a statin and was intolerant. I think most of them just wanted to experiment with lifestyle interventions first and found it was sufficient for them.
And Dave, that's really what led to the other study that we talked about in the previous show, that you want to see whether the high LDL in this subset of patients that you're calling low mass hyper-responders or lean mass hyper-responders, whether there's any atherosclerotic heart disease with continued observation. So that's really the subject of the other study that we talked about, right?
Yeah, and that one's of course ongoing. I announced it in September. I think we started scanning in October. So there's like a 6-month recruitment process. By the way, if you don't mind, I'm going to fit in a plug. If anybody is themselves a lean mass hyperresponder and would be interested in participating in this study, just go to citizensciencefoundation.org/study. Like I said, it's by the time you air this, there'll probably still be another 3 months of recruitment still ongoing.
So let's go. I'm going to have you put your critical hat on your own study, because there are no perfect studies. I'm going to always stand by that. This does not mean the studies are not valid. Just unfortunately, science is never perfect. Despite the imperfection of science, I've always argued we still have to take care of patients and make recommendations despite that. I guess the first criticism I heard a couple of criticisms, and I want you to try to provide your own critical appraisal of your own paper. But one of the criticisms I heard is that this lean mass hyper-responder thing is something that you guys invented. There's no such a thing in science that is called lean mass hyper-responder. It is a term that was invented on Facebook. Your response.
Dave, take this one.
So this, of course, you could also say about metabolic syndrome. There's a recognition of patterns, and somebody puts a name on this pattern, and then that becomes a means by which to advance study on the pattern. So take metabolic syndrome. I'm sure you're familiar with all the 5 criteria, right? It's 2 of those are atherogenic dyslipidemia, so it's typically triglycerides, and they have arbitrary cut points. Triglycerides of, I believe, 150 and higher. HDL of, I think, under 40, but it also is high blood pressure, high glucose, I think glucose that's above 100, and waist to hip ratio. And again, all of these were observed, reported. I think it originally started Syndrome X or changed to Syndrome X at some point and then changed back. But the point is, that's exactly how science works, as I understand it to be, is that particularly if you have a combination of something like atherogenic dyslipidemia, then you put a name to it, and for sure somebody was the first to name it whatever it's being called, and that's where it emerges. And this paper is basically our way by which to even further elucidate what it is that we mean by it beyond just the blog post from 2017.
Okay, so let's go other elements that you look at your paper and say, well, these are certain things, because I think one of the other major criticisms, and then those are the 2 major criticisms I see, and then I want you to do the whole thing. The other major criticism I see is that, or I hear about, is whatever you say, or whatever the paper that you just published, it is going to become more of a weapon in the statin deniers and people who really want any other excuse not to take a statin, while there are so much evidence that statins will reduce the risk of heart attacks and so on. And I think me and you and Ethan went through that in the other podcast, but that's really that, you're saying that this is not something to worry about, and that's really the concern that people have.
Before I answer that, because I would like to answer it, I think Nick has something he'd probably want to say to this as well. So I think it'd be cool if both of us.
Sure, of course.
Go ahead, Nick.
I mean, I was actually going to look for like the, lines in the paper where we basically say that's not the case, where like the paper does not say that to any stretch of the imagination. So to use this as a weapon to justify the safety of high LDL, when we continually say in the paper that, this paper is not about risk, and the conservative approach would still be to approach lipid lowering therapy, and here's a way to actually lower your LDL, we're demonstrating with lifestyle change, is just a perversion of what the paper is actually saying. And in addition to that, I honestly think that, the statin denier movement, it's like, it's already there. And for the lean mass hyper-responders who are actually on the fence about what to do, I think a lot of them, the default is, there isn't research on me. I'm a unique, I'm part of a unique population. So in order to be convinced to take a medication, because first, do no harm, right? You should only apply, data in the population in which it was studied. Then I want more data on me before I am convinced to take a statin or PCSK9 or whatever. And so what we're really doing, or what Dave has really done quite incredibly by raising money for this subsequent study on risk, is trying to provide those data to better inform lean mass hyper-responder patients about what they should do. Because, yes, ideally, all things being equal, I think a lot of LMHR would actually love to just add a sweet potato to their diet and reverse their phenotype. But the fact of the matter is, and I don't think people fully appreciate that, there are a lot of people that aren't in a position to do that. A lot of people who are using ketogenic low-carb diets therapeutically, very low-carb diets for epilepsy, neurological diseases, neurodegenerative diseases, inflammatory bowel diseases. And for them, extreme carbohydrate restriction is therapeutic. Adding back the carbs doesn't really work, nor do the medications necessarily work, or they might be intolerant. So they're really on the fence about, they're not comfortable with their high LDL. They don't know what to do, but they don't really have really great information, because that population hasn't been studied on how high their risk really is, to inform their decision and to inform their discussion with their physician. And so I think this paper is extremely important, because I think it's dangerous not to study these individuals. And now you can see I'm getting a little bit emotional on this topic, because I am one of these, people. I think for a long time, the population has been told, you're not real, you don't exist. This must be some sort of genetic fluke. And it's a phenotype that's right on everybody's nose. So what this paper is really trying to do is just put lean mass hyper-responders on the map and say, this is real, this deserves to be studied, not only for the purpose of the individual patients and their patient right, but also just because of all it can tell us about lipidology and risk. I mean, this is basically objectively, I guess it is technically subjective, but a fascinating phenotype. Wherever you stand on the LDL issue, this paper is not talking about that. This paper is observing something that is fascinating, to the point that you can drop LDL 480 milligrams per deciliter with a freaking sweet potato. How is that just not cool from a scientific perspective? And I just hope we can all get together behind the fact that this is interesting and study it, and in a scientific manner. I guess that's my 2 cents on that. I'm going to pass it back over to Dave.
Dave.
So definitely to round back to statin therapy, I need to emphasize this as strongly as I ever can. And Chatty, I know you've been following me a while. I know that you probably know this to not be hyperbole when I say this. I think that I say this is not medical advice more than any private individual I know on Twitter. There's nowhere in which I try to emphasize that I'm a medical professional or anything of the like. I usually am saying exactly the opposite. But that said, I want to do my best, even in my most defensive position for when I feel like I'm putting forth the nuance, to try to reach for any level of a credible argument that could be made, even if it's coming from folks who I feel like won't change their mind at all. And so in that regard, even when I'm getting hammered over and over again from some folks who have sort of a construct of me that I feel like is a bit much of a straw man. That said, I do try, even more than I ever have before, to emphasize why it is that there is uncertainty here. It's why we're doing this study. And I do want people to work with their doctor. It's why I said earlier that I'm putting more focus on the cautious and less on the optimistic, because before, when I had a few hundred followers and I could pontificate on these things and I could say, hey, this looks a lot like reverse atherogenic dyslipidemia, this profile. That is still true, that it does look a lot like reverse atherogenic dyslipidemia, but does that have potential, ramifications if I'm saying it without further matching it with additional gravity? Potentially, in which case, that's why I want to put more effort than I ever have before on. I want people to work with their doctors. I want to emphasize I'm not making recommendations on going on or off cholesterol-lowering medication. And as you know, I took extra steps in the last conversation we had with Ethan to put forward that at any given time, with my own health and my own risks, all options are on the table. There's no medication that I would say is off the table, particularly given as whatever my context is that changes, as Nick was just mentioning, I would care. And so we're in a lot of uncertainty now. If people want to take into account what the existing literature would say, what all the existing organizations would say that make recommendations on heart health and what your target lipid levels are, it's absolutely something I would understand. they're taking that consideration in mind, and not something I would actively discourage by any means. This is more a research endeavor than anything else. But that said, with all of that said, we need to go get the data. I feel more urgency than I ever have before, Chatty. I just, speaking as one human to another, we can't keep sitting around on this. We need to find out just what level of risk there is, if there is, and how much. We've got to get it.
I think it's certainly a reasonable question to ask, and I see both sides and so on. And I'll give that to you, Dave. I think I've been doing this for a long time, and I think I consider myself a reasonable moderator. You certainly are very calm, cool, and collected. Although even in the heat of the moment, you're able to step back and answer questions without being very. You don't get emotional easily. So I that actually is always very good and appreciated.
Guilty.
So let in the last 15 minutes, what I want to talk about is maybe what have you seen the reception of the paper? The paper came out, and whether social media, not social media, good, bad, and ugly, I guess. Maybe we'll take one observation from Nick, one observation from Dave. And Nick, when you speak, just be mindful. I think the microphone, I hear some static. So just so I want to make sure it doesn't capture, because it's pretty sensitive. So Nick, what has been, maybe share with us a couple of feedback, observations you've noticed after it came out, and maybe Dave can share some of that as well. I'm curious what's been the reception in the community after the paper came out.
Yeah. Well, Chetty, I have the benefit of being able to be distracted, I guess you could say, by medical school most of the time. And that's the community in which I've been talking about this paper with my peers and with my professors, even more so on social media. And what's unique about that is, the social media, especially Twitter space around this paper, is very charged. People come into it, and looking at it through a certain lens, whereas when I talk about this research to, other Harvard medical students, my professors, my preceptors at the hospital, most of them are naive to this phenomenon. And in that context, I've been very pleased to note that people's reactions are what personally I think they should be, which is maybe concern, but interest. Universally wow, that's interesting. Whether I bring it to cardiologists, whether I bring it to first-year med students, it's this is weird. This is niche. This is interesting. I really just want to know what's going on. And that's the reception I've seen, genuine interest, and, and wanting to see how this story later develops, and wanting to know a little bit more about the mechanisms that might be going on behind the scene, because like I keep saying, it's interesting.
Dave, what has been the reception in your world?
The reception has been generally amazing. I have really appreciated all of the great comments. I will say, of course, there have been some who've been critical, but I would like to also say, in many respects, some of the criticisms were valid. Things that we could have changed or tweaked with the wording that's now being considered for the drafts that we're doing. I can personally call out Michael Mindrum. I think
Midrum, I always put an N there. I don't know why I do.
I know. He was great, and he had like a single comment on a single word change that really nailed exactly what we kind of wanted to say anyway. It was just an otherwise in the final sentence, which will be there probably by the time you air this. But the one thing that I'm very proud of that I'd been literally talking about for years before this happened was, and Chatty, you know this because you and I have chatted about it several times before this point, is the importance of transparency. And I'm very proud that even with our uncorrected draft, we immediately put out all of the data and code. And so there were lots of people that, as part of the feedback process, were finding things that they brought to our attention, that I'm glad they brought to our attention so that we could address them directly. Because to me, that's good science. It goes back to fourth grade. When your science teacher says, show me the work. I feel like showing the work is something we need to be doing a lot more of. And in that regard, I'm thankful, because I feel as though the degree of reception and how people are providing that feedback loop, it's only going to make our process better. It's only going to make our work stronger.
So the paper that I read and was posted is not in the final format. It's still like this was online, I presume, and it's coming in print in January, or what was that?
Yeah, the American Society of Nutrition, which is the organization affiliated with the journal in which we published, they have an interesting practice of when you get the paper accepted, they put on the and you respond to the reviewers and stuff, the unedited copy online immediately, but the accepted unedited copy, and then there's a period during which you have the typesetting and the review. So the actual final version with the graphical abstract and everything is going to go probably online in mid-January, so probably prior to the time that this goes up. But the original version that went out will be subject to a little bit of change, which is fantastic because this has gotten a lot of attention. And like Dave said, comments from Michael really help. We try to be as precise as possible in our wording, but when you have not just 5 eyes on it, but 20,000, then people pick up things and make suggestions for improvements that then you actually get the chance to implement before the final copy. So
almost like a preprint type of thing. And
it is a preprint, basically.
In Dave's case, almost 60,000 people. That's 120,000 eyes. But anything, guys, I should have asked you about the paper, the research that I want to make sure I just give a rounded full view. I think we talked about the paper, the methods, the findings. We talked about some of the shortcomings, the criticisms. Actually, I want to go back. My last question, and then you tell me if anything I missed. Nick, you were telling me if you had $1 million, the study would have been different. What would have changed if you had $1 million?
Oh, well, I mean, I wouldn't have done exactly this study. There's a lot of study. I have a lot of wish list studies. But we're actually going through, I was just brainstorming a few today to assess the lipid energy model. And there's a lot of tests we could do to, actually test that this model is real. So for example, tracer studies. We don't know that there's increased, LPL mediated VLDL turnover. We could test that. We could test the levels of various LPL regulators and complexes, these proteins, ANGPTLs. And if you want to read a really cool paper, Ren Zhang just came out with one in Progress in Lipid Research on the ANGPTL 348 model. So for metabolism nerds, it's such a good read. Dave can confirm. We could do, experiments to see just how reproducible this phenotype is. Take people who are lean and see if we can make them into lean mass hyper-responders. Take people who are lean mass hyper-responders and see if we can manipulate their LDL levels by making them exercise more and less. You could do the reverse of that, not the gym hypothesis, like I was just describing, but the couch hypothesis. If you take lean mass hyper-responders and put 20 pounds on them and make them just, sit around, does their LDL go down? And then, of course, there's the risk trial that Dave's doing. I mean, there's no end to the avenues of research in this respect. And those are just human studies, a lot you could do in mice. But this study was just to get the conversation going, and I think it achieved that aim.
You certainly did. Dave, any questions I needed to ask you guys that I forgot?
No, but I do want to add something, and I think it might be a good capstone to this that kind of goes off of what Nick's saying. I have been saying this a long time, and I think I feel stronger about it than I ever have before. While I can't say that I know for sure, where our existing hypotheses are going to land or what our predictions are going to show, particularly with the energy model and so forth, I will stand behind this, Chatty, and I hope we're chatting again in 3 years, 5 years, et cetera. I do believe this phenotype, lean mass hyper-responders in particular, people with this extraordinary triad, I think they are going to teach us a lot, not just about this fat-adapted context, but about metabolism overall. I think that they're going to be an enormously powerful group of individuals for where we can get more scientific discovery. And that's something I'd love to, unearth again in a few years' time, and we'll see if you agree with me on that one.
I probably will, or I won't. What do I know? I'm a reporter. I'm just a host. Guys, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I'm hoping that we will air this late January or early February 2022. By then, the final version of the paper will be out. And as always, thanks for supporting Healthcare Unfiltered.
Thanks so much.